mean I'll see it.
I honestly didn't think much of it when my parents first showed up with that wardrobe. You know how it is when you get your first apartment, you're so desperate to fill the empty space that you don't really care where the furniture comes from. They told me they'd picked it up at an estate sale out in the sticks, some old Victorian house where the owner had passed away without any heirs. It was a massive piece of cedar, so dark it was almost black, with these intricate carvings of vines and flowers that looked way too sharp to be decorative. It took 3 of us just to get it through the front door. It felt substantial, like it was anchored to the floor by more than just its own weight. It had this presence, you know? Like it was taking up more air in the room than it should have. The smell was the first thing that really got to me. Most cedar smells clean, right? Like a forest or a chest of blankets. This wasn't like that. It smelled like a basement that had been sealed shut for 50 years, like wet earth and rotting vegetation. I figured it just needed to air out, so I left the door standing wide open for the first few days. But the scent didn't fade. It seemed to seep into my clothes, into the carpet, until my whole bedroom felt damp and stagnant. I'd wake up in the morning and my throat would feel coated in a thin layer of something oily. The thumping started about a week later. It was always in the dead of night, right when the rest of the building went silent. I'd be drifting off, that half-awake state where your brain starts to play tricks on you, and then I'd hear it. A slow, rhythmic thump, thump, thump. It wasn't the sharp crack of wood settling or the scurry of a mouse behind the baseboards. It was dull, muffled. It sounded exactly like a heel hitting the bottom of a hollow box. I tried to rationalize it. I told myself it was the humidity affecting the old wood, or maybe the floorboards were shifting under the weight of the thing. But then it started happening every single night, always at the exact same time, 3 hours after midnight. I'd lie there in the dark, staring at the silhouette of that wardrobe, and I'd listen to that steady, deliberate beat. It felt less like a sound and more like a vibration that traveled through the floor and up into my mattress, settling right in my chest. One night, I got fed up. I was tired, I was cranky, and I just wanted to sleep. I grabbed my flashlight and marched over to the wardrobe, swinging the doors open so hard they hit the wall. I expected to see a trapped squirrel or maybe a loose panel. Instead, I found nothing. Just my shirts hanging there, limp and smelling of that foul, damp earth. I pulled everything out, throwing my clothes into a heap on the floor, determined to find the source. That's when I noticed the back panel wasn't flush against the frame. There was a tiny gap, barely wide enough to slip a credit card through. I grabbed a flathead screwdriver and started prying at it, thinking maybe a pipe was knocking behind the wall. The wood groaned as I pulled, a sound that felt weirdly like a sigh. When the panel finally popped loose, a small scrap of yellowed paper fluttered out and landed on my feet. It was old, the edges brittle and stained. The handwriting was frantic, deep indentations in the paper like the person had been pressing down with everything they had. It only said one thing: don't let him out of the wood. I stood there in the middle of my room, shivering in my boxers, holding that note while the silence of the apartment felt like it was pressing in on my eardrums. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I just sat on the edge of my bed, watching the dark opening I'd created in the back of the wardrobe. It felt like a mouth. The next night, things got visceral. I hadn't put the panel back yet. I was too freaked out to touch it. Around 3 a.m., the thumping didn't just start, it exploded. It wasn't a rhythmic beat anymore. It was a violent, frantic thrashing. The entire wardrobe began to rock, its massive frame bucking against the hardwood floor. I could hear the wood splintering, the sound of the grain tearing apart like frozen meat being pulled from a bone. I scrambled back against the headboard, fumbling for my phone to call someone, anyone, but I couldn't take my eyes off the wardrobe. In the dim glow of my street lamp, I saw the wood of the side panels start to bulge. It looked like something was underneath the surface, a shoulder or a knee pushing outward, trying to stretch the cedar like it was skin. Then the smell hit me. It wasn't just rot anymore. It was the scent of a butcher shop that had lost its refrigeration. A thick, suffocating aroma of raw, iron-rich fluid and salt. It was so intense I could taste it on the back of my tongue. I watched, paralyzed, as a dark, viscous liquid began to seep from the cracks in the wood. It wasn't sap. It was too dark, too thick. It looked like clotted syrup, and it pulled on my floor in a way that felt intentional. I didn't wait. I didn't think. I ran out of that apartment and spent the rest of the night in my car, shaking so hard I could barely hold my keys. The next morning, I went back with a friend and a roll of heavy-duty duct tape. I didn't explain much, just told him the thing was infested with mold and I needed it out. We taped the doors shut, layer after layer of silver tape until the wardrobe looked like a cocoon. My friend kept commenting on how the wood felt sticky and how the weight seemed to shift when we tilted it. He said it felt like the thing was full of wet sand. We hauled it to a local junkyard, one of those places with a massive industrial shredder. I paid the guy an extra $50 to put it at the front of the line. I needed to see it destroyed. I needed to know it was gone. As the crane lifted the wardrobe, it swung through the air, and for a second, the tape strained. I could hear a muffled, wet slapping sound coming from inside, like someone hitting a piece of raw steak against a table. The operator dropped it into the hopper of the shredder. When the metal teeth first bit into the cedar, the sound that came out wasn't mechanical. It was a high, thin, gurgling wail. It sounded like a human throat trying to scream while filled with liquid. It was a wet, tearing noise that cut right through the roar of the engine. Then came the spray. It wasn't with chips. Not at first. A fountain of that dark, iron-smelling fluid erupted from the hopper, coating the yellow metal of the shredder in a layer of deep, brownish red. Chunks of something that definitely wasn't wood flew out, pale, fibrous bits that looked like gristle and bone, tangled in the splinters of the cedar. The smell was so overwhelming that my friend actually vomited right there on the gravel. The shredder groaned, its engine straining as it worked through the material. For a few seconds, I saw what looked like a hand, or something that used to be a hand, pressed against the side of the metal teeth before it was dragged down and pulverized. It was long, too long, with fingers that had too many joints, all of them coated in that thick, dark sludge. The operator stopped the machine, looking pale. He climbed down and stared at the mess, the red liquid dripping from the gears. He asked me what the hell had been in that wardrobe. I couldn't answer him. I just turned around and walked away. I moved out of that apartment a week later. I left most of my clothes behind. I couldn't get the smell out of them, no matter how many times I washed them. But the thing is, sometimes, when I'm in my new place, in the middle of the night, I'll hear a floorboard creak. Just a single, dull thump. And I can't help but wonder, if the wardrobe was just a shell, where did the rest of him go when the wood broke?
Next story.
We found the bed on one of those local resale apps. It looked perfect, a vintage, dark oak toddler frame with high rails that felt safe, sturdy, and way more expensive than the $50 the guy was asking for. My wife, Sarah, was thrilled because it fit that rustic nursery look she'd been obsessing over for months. We picked it up from a storage unit on the outskirts of town. The guy who sold it to us didn't say much. He didn't even look us in the eye. He just took the cash and watched from his rearview mirror as we strapped it into the back of the truck. At the time, I just thought he was weird or maybe in a rush. I didn't think twice about why someone would practically give away a piece of furniture that solid. After we got it home and scrubbed it down, it looked great. Our son, Leo, was just turning 3 and was so excited to move out of his crib. For the first 2 nights, everything was fine. He slept through the night, which was a miracle in itself. But by the middle of the first week, things started to shift. It began with the dampness. At first, I thought Leo had just started having accidents, but when I checked the sheets, They weren't soaked in one spot. They were just clammy. The entire mattress felt like it had been sitting out in a thick fog. It had this cloying, humid chill to it that never seemed to go away, no matter how high we turned up the heat. Then the night terrors started. Leo has always been a quiet kid, but the sounds coming out of his room at 2 in the morning were something else entirely. They weren't screams of frustration, they were sounds of genuine, primitive terror. When I'd rush in and flip the light on, he'd be huddled in the very corner of the bed, pressed against the rails, staring at the empty space in the middle of the mattress. His little face would be pale, almost blue, and his skin was always ice cold to the touch. He started talking about the man under the blanket. He'd point at the flat, undisturbed covers and whisper that the man was cold. He said the man wanted to share Leo's warmth because the water was too deep. We did the usual parent thing. We checked under the bed, we checked the closet, we told him it was just a bad dream. But Leo stopped playing in his room. He'd stand in the doorway, staring at that bed with a look of pure, unadulterated dread. The smell started a few days later. It wasn't a sudden stench, but a slow, creeping rot that seemed to seep out of the floorboards. It didn't smell like trash or sewage. It smelled like stagnant, standing water, the kind you find in a basement that's been flooded for months. It was the smell of wet earth, silt, and something else, something sweet and cloying, like the metallic tang of a butcher's shop where the meat has started to turn gray. It was thick. It felt like you were breathing in soup every time you crossed the threshold of that room. I started noticing bruises on Leo's arms and legs. Not the kind of bruises a toddler gets from running into a coffee table. These were distinct fingerprints. They were dark, mottled purple marks that looked like someone with immense strength had grabbed his small limbs and tried to pull him downward. When I asked him about them, he just looked at the bed and started crying. He said the man was trying to pull him under so they could sleep together in the dark. The breaking point happened on an afternoon while Sarah was out running errands. I was in the nursery, trying to be productive by folding a mountain of laundry. The sun was starting to dip, casting these long, jagged shadows across the room. I had a stack of Leo's shirts in my hands when I looked over at the toddler bed. The room was freezing. I could see my own breath misting in the air, a white plume of vapor that seemed to hang there, unmoving. The bed was made. Sarah had tucked the quilt in tight that morning. But as I watched, the center of the mattress began to dip. It wasn't a subtle movement. It was a slow, massive depression, as if someone very large and very dense had just sat down on the edge. The wooden frame creaked, a long, agonizing groan of stressed timber. I stood frozen. My heart was slamming against my ribs so hard it felt like it was going to bruise the bone. Then the indentation moved. It stretched out. I watched as the quilt began to drape over an invisible form. First the legs, then a torso, and finally a head. A full-grown person was lying under the covers of my 3-year-old's bed. The mattress was sagging under a massive weight that shouldn't have been there. I could see the distinct outline of shoulders, the curve of a skull pressing up against the fabric. The smell of the room suddenly became unbearable. It was no longer just stagnant water, it was the overwhelming stench of biological decay, the iron-thick scent of blood mixed with the slime of a riverbed. I felt a wave of nausea so intense I had to bite my tongue to keep from gagging. I don't know what possessed me. Maybe it was the instinct to protect my house, or maybe I just snapped. I dropped the laundry and stepped toward the bed. Every step felt like I was moving through waist-deep mud. The air was so cold it felt like needles pressing into my skin. I reached out, my fingers trembling, and I grabbed the edge of the quilt. "Get out," I croaked. My voice didn't even sound like mine. I lunged forward and ripped the blanket back with a violent jerk. For a split second, I saw it. I didn't see a person, not exactly. I saw a shape, a translucent, shimmering mass of gray, waterlogged flesh. It looked like a man who had been left in a lake for weeks. The skin was translucent and sloughing off in wet, ragged ribbons. There were no eyes, just dark, hollow pits filled with silt and mud. The thing sat up with a sudden, jerky motion, unnatural and fast, and its mouth opened. It wasn't a mouth so much as a jagged tear in its face, dripping with black, brackish fluid. And then it was gone. The mattress snapped back into place. The quilt fluttered to the floor. The room was empty. But the smell remained, and the mattress was soaking wet. Not with water, but with a thick, viscous slime that felt like decayed fat between my fingers. I didn't wait for Sarah to get home. I dragged that bed out of the house right then and there. I didn't even unscrew the bolts. I kicked it apart, my boots splintering the oak, and I hauled the pieces to the curb. I took the mattress to the backyard and doused it in lighter fluid. I watched it burn for 3 hours. The smoke was black and oily, and it smelled like a funeral pyre. A few days later, I started digging. I went back to the app and found the guy's profile, but it had been deleted. I spent hours at the local library, looking through old news archives from the town where the storage unit was located. I found it in an article from 2 years ago. There had been a flash flood in a small neighborhood near the river. An elderly man, a recluse who lived alone, had been caught in his sleep. The water had risen so fast it trapped him in his bedroom. By the time the rescue teams got to the house, the water had receded, but they found him in his bed. He had drowned in his sleep, pinned down by a heavy wardrobe that had tipped over in the current. The article had a photo of the bedroom. It was grainy, but I could see it. The dark oak bed frame. The reporter mentioned that the body had been badly decomposed by the time it was recovered because it had been submerged in the stagnant, warm floodwater for nearly 10 days. The skin had literally bonded to the mattress. We moved out of that house a month later. We left most of our furniture behind. Leo is 6 now, and he still won't sleep in a bed with a frame. He insists on a mattress directly on the floor, in the middle of the room, far away from the walls. Sometimes, when it rains particularly hard, I see him standing in the hallway, staring into the dark, sniffing the air. I don't tell him that I smell it too. The scent of wet earth and salt. The feeling of something cold and sodden, waiting for a place to rest its weighted, rotting bones.
Next story.
My grandmother's house always felt like a place where time went to die. It was filled with these massive, dark pieces of furniture that seemed to swallow the light from the windows. When she passed away, most of my cousins fought over the jewelry or the silver, but I wanted the vanity. It was this beautiful, old trifold desk, the kind of thing you see in movies from the 40s. It had these deep, intricate carvings along the legs and 3 massive mirrors that could be angled so you could see yourself from every possible direction. I had it moved into my bedroom, right against the far wall facing my bed. For the first few weeks, I loved it. There was something elegant about sitting there, surrounded by 3 versions of myself. But the feeling of the room changed almost immediately. You know that sensation when you're in a room alone, but you feel like someone is standing just a few inches behind you? It was like that, constantly. The air in my bedroom started to feel thick, dense, like I was walking through invisible curtains of cobwebs every time I stepped inside. I started noticing small things. Subtle things. I'd be brushing my hair, looking into the center mirror, and out of the corner of my eye, I'd see the reflection in the left mirror move. Just a fraction of a second after I did. It was a lag, like a bad internet connection, but in real life. I told myself it was just the lighting, or maybe the way the old glass was cut. Antique mirrors are known to have those weird distortions, right? I tried to ignore it. I tried to convince myself that I was just tired from the move. The smell started about a month in. It wasn't a rot, exactly. It was more like the sharp, cloying scent of a fresh wound, that raw, iron-like stench that hits the back of your throat and makes your stomach flip. I checked the floorboards, the walls, even the vents. Nothing. But whenever I sat at that desk, the smell was so potent I could almost taste it. It was the smell of a butcher shop floor after a long day. Then came the night when everything broke. I was getting ready for a late dinner. The room was dim, lit only by a single lamp on my nightstand and the small bulbs I'd strung around the vanity. I was leaning in close to the center mirror, trying to get my eyeliner straight. My face was only a few inches from the glass. I blinked, and the reflection in the center mirror blinked back. Everything was normal. But then I glanced to the left. The version of me in the left mirror wasn't blinking. It was staring. Her eyes were wide, the whites of them bloodshot and bulging, fixed directly on me with a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. My heart didn't just race, it felt like it was trying to punch its way out of my ribs. I stayed perfectly still, my eyeliner pencil frozen against my lid. I was terrified that if I moved, she would too. I slowly shifted my gaze to the right mirror. My breath caught in my throat. The reflection on the right wasn't looking at me at all. It had its back turned. It was sitting on the vanity stool, just like I was, but it was facing away, looking into a darkness that didn't exist in my room. I could see the back of its head, the hair matted and tangled with something dark and wet. The silence in the room became deafening. It was a suffocating, pressurized silence that made my ears ring. Then, the reflection with its back turned started to move. It didn't turn around quickly. It was a slow, agonizing rotation. I heard the sound of vertebrae popping, loud, wet snaps that sounded like dry branches breaking under a boot. As it turned, I realized it wasn't me. The skin was the color of a bruise, gray, mottled, and translucent. You could see the veins underneath, like dark, twisting worms. When it finally faced me, I wanted to scream, but my throat felt like it had been sewn shut. It didn't have eyes. Where the sockets should have been, there was just smooth, taut skin, like a blind cave fish. It was as if someone had stretched a layer of white parchment over its skull. The nose was a jagged, broken mess, and the mouth was just a thin, lipless slit that leaked a dark, viscous fluid. The thing in the left mirror, the one that was staring, started to grin. It pulled its lips back so far that the skin at the corners of its mouth began to tear, weeping a clear, yellowish fluid. Its teeth were jagged and yellow, looking more like shards of broken bone than actual teeth. Then, the eyeless thing in the right mirror reached out. It didn't just reach out in the reflection. It leaned forward, and its hand, a long, spindly thing with fingernails that were cracked and caked with dried filth, passed through the surface of the glass. The mirror didn't break. It rippled, like a stone being dropped into a dark pond. I felt a palm press against my actual cheek. It wasn't just cold. It was freezing, a deep, stinging chill that felt like dry ice searing my flesh. The hand was wet, covered in a slick, oily substance that smelled like a morgue. I could feel the individual ridges of its fingerprints, the grime scratching against my skin. The pressure was intense, forcing my head to the side, pushing me toward the center mirror. The me in the center mirror was gone now. In its place was a void. A black, bottomless hole. I finally found my voice. I let out a sound that wasn't even a scream, it was a choked, guttural sob. I grabbed the heavy brass lamp from the vanity and swung it with everything I had. The sound of the glass shattering was the most beautiful thing I'd ever heard. I didn't stop with one hit. I swung again and again, screaming, my vision blurred by tears and the sudden spray of red. I didn't realize until later that the glass had sliced my arms to ribbons. I was hacking at the mirrors until they were nothing but jagged shards and dust. When the last piece of glass fell, the room went cold. Not a supernatural cold, just empty. The pressure in my ears snapped. The smell of raw iron was replaced by the stinging scent of my own blood. I was standing there, chest heaving, holding the lamp like a club, looking at the empty wooden frames of the vanity. I didn't sleep in that room that night. I didn't sleep for 3 days. I called a friend to help me move the desk into the garage, but I couldn't bring myself to throw it away. My grandmother had it for 50 years. I kept thinking about her, how she'd gone blind in her final years, and how she'd always insisted on keeping a thick, dark canvas draped over the vanity whenever she wasn't using it. I thought she was just being eccentric. Now, I think she was hiding. I still have the desk out in the garage. It's covered with a thick, dark tarp, tied down with bungee cords so nothing can move it. But sometimes, when I'm out there looking for a tool or putting away the trash, I hear a sound coming from under that cloth. It's not a knock. It's not a tap. It's the sound of something wet, sliding, pressing its palm against the wood from the inside, searching for a way back out. I know I should burn it. I know I should chop it into pieces and scatter them in the woods. But every time I get close to it, I feel that suffocating weight on my chest again, and I can smell that butcher shop scent rising from the grain of the wood. The worst part isn't the desk, though. It's the mirrors in my bathroom. It's the windows at night. It's the screen of my phone when it goes black. Because now, whenever I see my reflection, I find myself counting the seconds. I wait to see if I blink first, or if she does. And sometimes, just for a heartbeat, I could swear the version of me in the glass is standing just a little bit closer than I am. I found the box about a week after I shoved the desk into the back of the garage. It was tucked behind a stack of old, moth-eaten blankets, right where the concrete floor meets the damp wall. It was a simple wooden crate, the kind people used for apples in the old days, but it was nailed shut with an obsessive amount of precision. When I finally pried the lid off with the back of a hammer, the scent hit me before I even saw what was inside. It wasn't that standard musty smell of an old house, it was that same sharp, raw meat stench that had been clinging to the vanity. It was the smell of a butcher shop drain that hadn't been washed in weeks, something primal and sickly sweet. Inside were 5 journals. They were leather-bound, the covers cracked and peeling like sunburnt skin. I took them into the kitchen, away from the oppressive, leaden atmosphere of the garage, and sat down under the harsh fluorescent light. I thought I'd find recipes or maybe some old family gossip. I was wrong. My grandmother, Evelyn, hadn't just been a collector of antiques, she had been a prisoner in her own bedroom for nearly 40 years. The first journal started out normal enough. She talked about the day she bought the vanity from an estate sale in the late 60s. She was young then, obsessed with her looks, the kind of woman who wouldn't even check the mail without a full face of makeup. She wrote about how the trifold mirrors made her feel like a movie star. But by the middle of that first book, the tone shifted. The handwriting, which had been elegant and looping, started to become jagged and cramped. She began mentioning the other. At first, she thought she was just seeing things, shadows moving in the glass when she wasn't looking directly at them. She described how the reflection in the left mirror would sometimes reach up to touch its hair a second before she did. She called it a delay in the soul. That was her term for it. She believed the mirrors weren't just reflecting light, but were somehow catching the lag of her own existence. By the second journal, the entries became much more disturbing. There was no mention of the outside world anymore. No mention of my grandfather or her children. It was all about the vanity. She wrote about how the others started to change. It wasn't her reflection anymore. It was becoming something else, something gray and sunken. She described the thing I saw in the garage, the eyeless, mottled creature. She called it her gray twin. The most gut-wrenching part was how she described the reflection tax. That's what she called the physical toll the desk took on her. She wrote about waking up with long, thin scratches on her cheeks that she couldn't explain. She wrote about the taste of rusted iron in her mouth every morning and how her skin was starting to turn a pale, sickly translucent gray, just like the thing in the glass. She was convinced that the mirrors were slowly draining the life out of her, pulling her physical form into the glass while pushing the other out into our world. The third journal was where the true crime aspect of her life started to bleed through. I remember my mom telling me that Grandma had a terrible accident in the 70s, which was why she went blind. The official story was that a cleaning chemical had splashed into her eyes. The journals told a much more visceral story. There was an entry from a night in the mid-70s, no specific date, just the mention of a moonless night. She wrote about sitting at the vanity for 6 hours straight, unable to move. The gray twin had its hands pressed against the glass from the inside, and Evelyn could feel the pressure on her own face. It was a crushing, suffocating sensation, like being buried alive under a pile of wet wool. The twin was whispering to her, not through sound, but through a vibration in her teeth. It told her that it couldn't see our world clearly. It told her that the light in her eyes was a barrier. It needed the light to be extinguished so it could finally cross over. The description of what happened next made me physically ill. She didn't use cleaning chemicals. She described, in excruciating detail, how she went into the sewing room and found her longest crochet hook. She wrote about standing before the center mirror, watching the gray twin smile a lipless, jagged grin as she held the cold metal tool up to her own face. She described the sensation of the pop as the hook went in a wet, squelching sound that seemed to echo inside her skull. She did it twice. Once for the left mirror. Once for the right. She wrote that as the world went dark, the smell of fresh, raw meat filled the room, and she felt a cold, wet hand stroke her hair in a gesture of horrific gratitude. She thought that by blinding herself, she was locking the door. She thought that if she couldn't see the twin couldn't see her. The fourth and fifth journals were written in a frantic, tactile scrawl. Since she couldn't see, she had used her fingers to guide the pen, leading to lines that overlapped and tore through the paper. These entries weren't stories, they were warnings. She realized too late that blinding herself hadn't locked the door, it had simply removed her ability to see who was coming through it. She spent the last 20 years of her life sitting in that room, listening to the sound of the other moving around. She wrote about hearing the sound of wet, bare feet dragging across the hardwood floor at night. She felt the bed sink beside her as something cold and lightless lay down next to her. She described the sensation of long, spindly fingers tracing the scars over her empty eye sockets while she slept, as if the thing was checking to make sure she was still closed. The final entry in the last book was just one sentence, written so hard that the pen had snapped at the end. "It is tired of waiting for me to die. I want someone who can still see." I closed the book and sat there in the silence of my kitchen. My skin felt tight, like it was being pulled toward the back of the house. I looked at my reflection in the chrome of the toaster, and for a split second, I didn't recognize the person looking back. The person in the toaster looked thinner, grayer. I went back out to the garage. I told myself I was going to burn the desk right then. I grabbed a can of gasoline and a lighter. But when I got to the back of the garage, I stopped. The tarp I had tied down with bungee cords, it wasn't flat anymore. There was a bulge underneath it, right where the stool would be. It looked like the shape of a person sitting perfectly still, their head bowed forward. The smell was unbearable now. It wasn't just the scent of a butcher shop, it was the smell of something that had been dead for a long time but was still somehow warm. I reached out to grab the edge of the tarp, my heart hammering against my ribs with a leaden, rhythmic thud. Just as my fingers brushed the fabric, I felt it. From the other side of the tarp, a hand gripped mine. It wasn't a firm grip. It was a soft, wet, sliding sensation, like being touched by a piece of raw liver. The fingers were impossibly long, and I could feel the sharp, broken edges of fingernails digging into my wrist. I didn't scream. I couldn't. I just stood there, paralyzed, as the thing under the tarp slowly started to stand up. The bungee cords groaned under the tension. The leaden weight in the air became so intense I thought I was going to black out. I don't remember how I got back into the house. I just remember the feeling of those wet fingers sliding off my skin as I bolted. I've locked the door to the garage and shoved a heavy dresser in front of it, but it doesn't matter. Every mirror in my house is now covered with blankets. I even painted over the one in the bathroom. But this morning, I was brushing my teeth and I looked down at the puddle of water in the sink. For a fraction of a second, before the water drained away, I saw it. I didn't see my own face. I saw a pair of smooth, skin-covered sockets staring back at me, and I could feel a faint, sharp itch right behind my left eyeball, like something was trying to hook onto it from the inside. I can hear the sound of the garage door rattling now. Not like someone is trying to get in, but like something is trying to get out. And the worst part is, I don't think I want to stop it anymore. The leaden pressure in my chest is becoming too much to carry. I find myself looking at the crochet hooks in my craft drawer. They look so cold, so sharp, so quiet. I think I understand now why Grandma was so calm at the end. Once the light is gone, you don't have to watch them coming for you anymore.
Next story. Next story is yours. Take a look at the shadow in the corner of your room. Are you sure it was that shape a minute ago? Subscribe or be the next in line.